Talking about here on my channel right now. It's all about Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively's.
The morning didn't just feel like any ordinary morning. It carried that strange tension that builds when something big is about to unfold. The kind of energy you can't quite explain, but you know it's there, sitting quietly beneath the surface. And as Las Hari opened the episode on Coravanta, there was already a sense that today's update wasn't going to be simple, wasn't going to be clean, and definitely wasn't going to favor everyone involved. Because the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni situation had officially entered that dangerous phase where narratives start colliding, truths get blurred, and every small detail suddenly begins to matter far more than it ever should. And with the trial now just weeks away, what used to be speculation was slowly transforming into strategy, calculated moves, and last-ditch efforts from both sides trying to shape what the jury will eventually see, hear, and believe. And right now the battlefield isn't even the courtroom yet. It's the pre-trial. Fight over evidence, over framing, over perception. Because in cases like this, whoever controls the story before the trial even begins already has 1 foot ahead. And that's exactly why Blake Lively's latest move has raised so many eyebrows. Because out of everything she could focus on, out of all the claims, all the accusations, all the tension that has built over months, she is now pushing hard for one specific detail to be included: comments about her weight. And on the surface, it sounds almost minor, almost irrelevant, something that wouldn't carry much weight in a legal battle this big. But the deeper you look, the more you start to realize that this isn't about weight at all. This is about narrative, about framing Justin Baldoni in a certain light, about reinforcing an idea that she has been trying to establish from the very beginning. That there was discomfort, that there was insensitivity, that there was something inappropriate happening behind the scenes. And according to her legal argument, those alleged comments are not just side details, they are essential context. A way for the jury to understand her claim that Baldoni didn't just disagree with her or clash creatively, but retaliated against her. And that word, retaliation, is where everything becomes complicated. Because while some of her claims have already been dismissed by the judge, including major ones like harassment, the retaliation claim still stands. And that's the thread she's holding on to, the one piece of ground that hasn't completely slipped away. And so now every piece of evidence she pushes forward has to somehow connect back to that, has to strengthen that argument, has to convince the court that what happened wasn't just a messy production or personality conflict, but something more intentional, more targeted, more harmful. And that's where the weight conversation comes in, because according to documents, Blake claims that ahead of a scene where Baldoni had to lift her, he reached out to her personal trainer to ask about her weight. And from her perspective, that wasn't just a practical question. It was something that crossed a line, something that made her uncomfortable, something that, in her view, contributes to a larger pattern of behavior. But Baldoni's side sees it very differently, because from their argument, it wasn't about judgment, it wasn't about criticism, it wasn't even directed at her personally. It was a logistical concern, a physical consideration, tied to his own health, because what often gets left out of the headline version of this story is that Baldoni was dealing with real physical issues at the time, including back problems that later escalated into a spinal infection serious enough to land him in the hospital. And when you look at it from that angle, the question shifts entirely, because now it's not why was he asking about her weight. It's, was he trying to avoid injury? And suddenly what one side presents as inappropriate behavior, the other side frames as basic precaution. And this is exactly why this detail has become so contested, because whichever version the jury believes will shape how they interpret everything else. And Las Hari points out something that adds another layer to this. Baldoni didn't even ask Blake directly. He went to her trainer instead, which could easily be seen as an attempt to avoid making her uncomfortable, to handle the situation discreetly. But somehow that decision is now being used against him, and that's where the situation starts to feel less like a clear-cut issue and more like a clash of perceptions, because intention and interpretation are two very different things, and in a courtroom that difference can decide everything. And while Blake is pushing for those details to be included, Baldoni's team is pushing just as hard to keep them out, arguing that they are irrelevant to the actual legal claims and would only serve to bias the jury, painting him in a negative light without directly proving retaliation. And the judge hasn't made a final decision yet, which means this small but explosive detail is still hanging in the balance, waiting to either become a key piece of the trial or be completely erased from it. And that uncertainty is part of what's making this entire situation feel so unpredictable, because no one really knows how it's going to unfold, not even the people directly involved. And while all of this legal maneuvering is happening, there's another layer quietly building in the background, one that doesn't involve official filings or courtroom arguments but might end up being just as impactful. the public narrative, the perception outside the courtroom, because while the legal case focuses on evidence and claims, the court of public opinion operates on something much more emotional, much more reactive, and that's where things start to get even messier, because as more details come out, as messages leak, as behind the scenes dynamics get exposed, it's becoming harder to maintain a clean, controlled image, and that's especially true when you bring Ryan Reynolds into the picture,
to any of
because
my
his involvement has added an entirely new dimension to this story, one that goes beyond the original conflict and starts to reveal how much pressure, strategy, and frustration has been building behind the scenes, particularly through a series of emails that have now surfaced, showing a side of him that the public rarely sees, a side that isn't polished or carefully curated, but raw, frustrated, and deeply invested in how the situation is being handled. And in those messages, you can see a clear shift from concern to anger, from trying to manage the situation to reaching what he himself describes as a breaking point. Because from his perspective, this wasn't just about a film rollout or a few negative headlines. It was about a larger failure to protect Blake, to control the narrative, to push back against criticism in a way that he believed was necessary. And what's striking about those emails isn't just what he's saying, but how he's saying it, the urgency, the intensity, the insistence that the response needs to be stronger, more direct, more aggressive, because in his view, the approach being taken wasn't enough, it wasn't working, and it was leaving Blake exposed to backlash that he believed was unfair. But here's where things start to get complicated again, because while he frames it as a coordinated smear campaign against her, there's another perspective that suggests something much simpler, that the backlash wasn't orchestrated at all, it was organic, a reaction from the public to how the film was marketed, how certain interviews came across, how certain decisions were perceived. And if that's the case, then no amount of PR strategy or carefully crafted statements would have been able to fully control it, and that disconnect between perception and reality is what seems to be driving so much of the tension behind the scenes, because if you believe you're being targeted unfairly, your response will be very different than if you accept that the criticism is genuine, and from those emails, it's clear which side Ryan Reynolds was leaning toward, pushing for stronger statements, demanding accountability from the studio, insisting that they publicly defend Blake in a way that left no room for ambiguity. But the studio didn't follow through with that approach. They hesitated. They chose a more measured response, and that decision only added to the frustration because from his point of view, anything less than full support wasn't enough. And that's where you start to see the cracks, not just between the parties involved in the lawsuit, but within the broader network of people connected to the project. Because when pressure builds to that level, it doesn't stay contained, it spreads, affecting relationships, decisions, and ultimately the direction of the entire situation. And now, with the trial approaching, all of those tensions, all of those disagreements, all of those competing narratives are about to collide in one place, under one set of rules, in front of a jury that will have to sort through all of it and decide what actually matters. And that's where everything starts to feel a lot more real, because up until now, this entire situation has existed in fragments. Clips, leaks, statements, reactions. But once it enters the courtroom, all of those scattered pieces are forced into a single timeline, a single narrative, and suddenly there's no room left for vague explanations or carefully dodged questions, because every claim has to be backed, every accusation has to be connected, and every emotional argument has to survive legal scrutiny. And that's exactly why what's happening right now in these final weeks before the trial matters so much more than people realize. Because this isn't just preparation, this is positioning. This is both sides trying to quietly build the version of the story they want the jury to believe before a single opening statement is even made. And if you really look at it closely, you can already see the shape of those two competing stories forming, almost like two completely different versions of the same reality, because on one side, you have Blake lively presenting a narrative where she was put in uncomfortable situations, where boundaries were blurred, where decisions made behind the scenes contributed to an environment that she now frames as retaliatory. And on the other side, you have Justin Baldoni presenting something that feels far more grounded in logistics, in production challenges, in the reality of trying to complete a film under pressure with too many moving parts and too many voices trying to steer the direction at the same time. And when those two narratives collide, the question isn't just who's right. It's which version feels more believable when all the noise is stripped away, because that's what juries tend to respond to. Not just facts, but coherence, consistency, and whether the story being told actually holds together when you look at it from every angle. And this is where some of the smaller details that might seem insignificant at first start to carry unexpected weight, like those early text messages between Blake and Baldoni, because they don't just show what was said, they show tone, timing, and intent. And when Blake asked about scheduling certain scenes later, particularly body-focused scenes, it didn't come across as a demand. It came across as someone trying to manage her own situation, someone who had just gone through a major life event and was trying to balance personal recovery with professional expectations, and Baldoni's response, at least on the surface, didn't come across as dismissive or aggressive. It came across as someone dealing with the reality of a tight production schedule, where flexibility isn't always possible, especially on a smaller film where delays can have serious consequences. And this is where context becomes everything, because if you isolate that exchange, you could interpret it in multiple ways, but when you place it within the broader timeline of events, it starts to paint a clearer picture of what the working relationship actually looked like, and more importantly, where it may have started to break down, because one of the recurring themes in this entire situation is control, who had it, who wanted more of it, and how that imbalance may have contributed to the conflict that followed. Because from multiple accounts, it's been suggested that Blake didn't just want to act in the film. She wanted a deeper level of involvement, creative input, influence over decisions that typically fall under the director's role, and in a perfect environment, that kind of collaboration can work, but in a high-pressure setting with limited time and resources, it can quickly turn into friction, especially if there isn't a clear boundary between roles, and that's where the idea of too many cooks in the kitchen starts to feel less like a cliché and more like a very real problem that may have been happening behind the scenes, because when multiple people are trying to shape the same project in different ways, it doesn't just slow things down, it creates tension, it creates misunderstandings, and eventually it creates sides, and once sides start forming, it becomes very difficult to keep things professional, because every decision starts to feel personal, every disagreement starts to carry more weight than it should, and before long, what started as a creative difference turns into something much bigger, something that people begin to interpret through their own emotions rather than the actual situation, and that's where this entire case seems to live now, in that space between what happened and how it was perceived, because perception is what drives reactions, and reactions are what ultimately shape outcomes, both in the public eye and in the courtroom. And speaking of perception, one of the most revealing parts of this entire situation isn't even coming from the official filings or the legal arguments, it's coming from the way people around the situation have responded, or in some cases chosen not to respond, because silence can be just as telling as words. And when you look at the broader circle surrounding this film, the cast, the industry insiders, the media figures, you start to notice a pattern that doesn't fully align with the narrative of a coordinated smear campaign, because if there really was a unified effort to target Blake, you would expect to see a more consistent, more organized push from multiple directions, but what you actually see is something far more uneven, far more organic, a mix of criticism, indifference, and in some cases quiet distancing, and that's where the conversation starts to shift from was there a campaign to was there a reaction? Because those are two very different things, and understanding that difference is key to understanding why this situation has unfolded the way it has, because a campaign implies planning, coordination, intent, while a reaction implies something much simpler. People responding to what they see, what they hear, what they feel in the moment, and if the jury starts to lean toward that second interpretation, it could significantly weaken the foundation of the retaliation claim, because without a clear, provable effort to orchestrate backlash, the argument starts to lose its structure, and that's where the pressure really starts to build, because now it's not just about presenting evidence, it's about connecting dots in a way that feels undeniable, and that's never easy, especially when the situation itself is as complex and layered as this one. And while all of this is happening on the legal side, there's another factor quietly influencing everything. The way Blake is perceived as a public figure, because like it or not, celebrity status doesn't just bring visibility, it brings expectations, it brings assumptions, and it brings a certain level of scrutiny that can either work in your favor or against you depending on how you're viewed. And in Blake's case, that perception seems to be more complicated than it appears on the surface, because while she is undeniably famous, that fame doesn't necessarily translate into strong public support, and that distinction matters more than people think, because there's a difference between being recognized and being rallied behind, and in situations like this, that difference can shape how narratives are received, how claims are interpreted, and ultimately how much benefit of the doubt someone is given, because when people feel connected to a public figure, they're more likely to defend them, to question opposing narratives, to look for inconsistencies in the other side's argument. But when that connection isn't as strong, the reaction tends to be more neutral, more observational, and sometimes even more critical, and that seems to be the space Blake is currently navigating, where she has visibility but not necessarily unwavering support, and that creates a very different environment heading into a trial, because now the focus shifts even more heavily onto the strength of the case itself rather than the influence of public sentiment. And that's where everything comes back to the core question that this entire situation is built around. Was there actual retaliation? Or was this the result of a complicated, high-pressure production that spiraled into something bigger than it needed to be? And that's not a question that can be answered through headlines or social media debates. It's a question that will have to be carefully examined, piece by piece, detail by detail, in a courtroom where every word matters and every claim is tested. And as that moment gets closer, you can feel the tension building, not just between the two sides, but across the entire situation. Because once the trial begins, there's no more controlling the narrative in the same way. No more shaping the story through selective releases or strategic statements, because at that point, everything is laid out in the open, and whatever holds up under that level of scrutiny is what ultimately defines the outcome. And until then, all anyone can do is watch as the final pieces fall into place, knowing that whatever happens next isn't just going to impact the people directly involved. It's going to reshape how this entire story is remembered, because in the end, it's not just about what happened, it's about which version of what happened people believe.